Today's daf, Be'ezus Hashem, is daf Kuf, and we will begin daf Tzadik Tesam and Beis, like 4 lines from the Gemara, 5 lines with the word beginning Kohenesh Shinis Arev. We're discussing here a very interesting case. The Mishnah discussed in the previous page. Kohenesh, you have a woman who's a Kohenes, right? She's married to a Kohen. She gave birth, and her maid gave birth. The Kohen's maid gave birth, and the kids got mixed up. So one, it can happen. So one of them is a for sure Kohen, one baby is a for sure Kohen, and one is an Eved of a Kohen. So when they grow up, they don't know who's the Kohen and who's the Eved, right? So the Mishnah says that when they go to the granary is the manufacturing company where everybody who has grain has them processed over there. And it's over there at this big manufacturing plant where the Kahanim would line up and get and collect Truma. So they get one portion of Truma because a Kohen gets a portion of Truma for himself and for his Eved, but not 2 portions. It's counted as one family. So the Mishnah says, let's see, Kohenesh Shinis Arev, Chelik Echad. They get only one portion of distribution of Truma from that manufacturing plant called the Goyren. So because they're not 2 different Kohen, there's one Kohen and one Eved. So the Gemara says, Pshita, that's obvious. So the Gemara says, Eima Chelik Echad, a very important point, that the only ones that could come, they have to come together to collect that portion. In other words, one cannot come without the other. Because Tanan, Command the Omar, there's an opinion in the Mishnayos that says, Ein Cholkim Truma le'Eved, you don't distribute Truma to a slave, Ela in came Rabbi Imai, only if his master comes with him. So you can't send, a Kohen can't send a slave to the granary, go pick me up my portion of Truma. You can't do that. The master has to accompany the slave. And maybe the slave will help him carry the Truma home, but he can't just send the slave to do it. You'll see for a very important reason. Because the Tanya we learned in the Brisa, Ein Cholkin Truma le'Eved, Ela im came Rabbi Imai de Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says you can't distribute Truma to a slave unless the master accompanies him. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi Aimer Yochel Sheimer Yochel he could. Sheimer he could say in Kohen Ani. He could say even if he's not sure if he's the Kohen or he's the slave. You could say Tnu li b'shvil atzmi. Give it if I'm the Kohen, then give it to me. Then Eved Kohen Ani. If I'm just the slave of the Kohen, Tnu li b'shvil Rabbi. Give it. I'm taking it on behalf of my master. In other words, Rabbi Yossi says a slave could pick up the Truma on behalf of his master. So this guy, if he doesn't know if he's an Eved or not, could come and pick up the Truma. Now, the reason why Rabbi Yehuda holds a very important point. The reason why Rabbi Yehuda holds, you can't just send your slave to pick up the Truma from you, because everybody who's seen walking into that granary, on the Truma line, is assumed to be a Kohen. And if you allowed your slave to stay on that line, people are going to mistakenly assume that slave is a Kohen, is a regular Kohen. And people will allow that slave to marry a Bas Yisrael, which is not permitted. So that's why Rabbi Yehuda said, no, you have to have a Kohen with him. And it has to be clearly defined who's the boss and who's the slave. Because Rabbi Yehuda, says the Gemara, they would assume that somebody who's on the line of Truma automatically is a kosher person and he can marry a Bas Yisrael. Therefore, you have to make sure not to just send the slave there by himself, because people will make the mistake that slave is a regular Jew. But Rabbi Yossi, in the city of Rabbi Yossi, they would never assume somebody who's on the line from Truma is a kosher person. So they never made that mistake. So according to Rabbi Yossi, you could send the slave alone to pick up the Truma. Tanya, we learned in a Brisa. Amar Rab Lozer ben Tzaddik. Rab Lozer ben Tzaddik was saying a story about himself. Miyamai, in my entire life, I never testified. Only one time. I just didn't like this whole business of testifying and, raising your hand and, affirming that you're saying the truth. But the one time I did it, I messed up because I said testimony about an Eved and it really was a slave, and I said he's a Kohen. So the Gemara says, "Hello, salkadaitach." Did they make such a big mistake? How could a tzaddik make such a mistake? The Gemara says, "Hashta, isn't it so? Behemton shal tzaddikim ein hakodesh baruch hu mevi tekol al yodim." The animal of a tzaddik will not be doing avera. Hashem will not allow an avera done by an animal of a tzaddik. Tzaddikim atzma like kolshkein. Certainly, the tzaddikim himself, Hashem is not going to allow a tzaddik to mess up. If you have a year of Shemayim, Hashem's you're not going to make a mistake. Ella, says the Gemara, no. He said about a certain person, I saw him online in the granary. But it turns out that was in the city of Rabbi Yossi, where slaves went by themselves to the granary. And then he said testimony in the place of Rabbi Yehuda. And when he said the testimony in the place of Rabbi Yehuda, automatically, if you were on that line, you were assumed to be a kohen. That's how this mistake happened. Ela bikshu lahalos eved lekahuna pi. They wanted to establish a slave that is a kohen on his testimony, because Chazer ba'asad Rabbi Yossi, he saw them, these people, this guy online in the city of Rabbi Yossi, which was no problem of having an eved alone on that line. Asid Rabbi Yehuda, and this Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzaddik said the testimony in the city of Rabbi Yehuda that anybody who's on that line was assumed to be a miyuchas. So that's how that mistake happened. Anyway, Nu Gemara, Tana Rabbanim. We just talked about the manufacturing plant. I mean, you have to understand this granary was a hub where Kahanim would line up to collect truma. It was easier for them to collect truma there. So the Meraisa says, Asora, there are 10 types of people. When they show up at the line, we don't give them their portion of truma, even though they're kahanim. We know they're kahanim, but we don't give it to them for various reasons. And the Mishnah Gemara is going to explain. The Elohim, Cherish, a kohen that's a deaf person, Shaita, or if he's imbecile, the cotton, or he's not bar mitzvah yet, Tumtim v'androginus. We know what that is. Tumtim, if his aver is covered up, we don't know if he's male or female. Androgynous means he has both organs. V'ha'eved, and a slave of a kohen. V'ha'ish, and a woman. V'aral, someone who's not circumcised. Technically, an oral could eat truma, but we're not distributing to him. So a kohen that's not circumcised, we don't give him the truma. V'hatame, a kohen that's tame, we don't allow him to collect. If a kohen married, let's say a grusha, and he shows up online, we're not going to give him the truma. It's like a knas, because you'll see. The kulan, mishagrim lehem lebateim, but all of them could eat truma, so we'll send a portion home. Like they do when somebody's in quarantine, they send them the lunch home. So they send it to him, they can send it to their house, but they don't want them in public to receive the truma. Somebody who's tamei, and who married, or somebody who married an unkosher woman, a kohen, we don't send them truma at all. Why? You can see, obviously, that if a kohen had the chutzpah to marry a grusha, we're not going to send them at all any truma. So the Gemara explains, Bishlam, it makes perfect sense, cherish, shaita v'katam. The reason why we don't distribute truma to a cherish, shaita v'katam, because la b'nei deyaninu, because they're not too smart, they're not normal people, and therefore this is degrading to a truma that you're giving it to homeless-like people, or people who are not so stable. Tumtim v'androgynous, nami, we don't distribute truma to a tumtim and androgynous. Okay, why? We go to Kufam and Aleph, Bria b'fnei atzminin. They're a separate entity. They're a separate type of human. In other words, androgynous. I mean, if you work in hip neighborhoods, you see that the people who they dress funny and they are gayish, so therefore it's like degrading for truma. You're distributing truma to such type of people, so it's not distributed to them. But we send them a package home, but we don't give it to him when they line up. Evan Name, we don't give it to a slave that lines up, even if he's collecting it for his master. Because people assume that he's a regular kohen, and people are going to assume that he can marry a regular Jew, and really he's only an evet. Oral v'tamei, we don't give it to truma to an oral or a tamei mishum demi-isi, because it's also degrading to give truma to somebody who's not circumcised, or to somebody who's tamei. Now the tamei is not going to eat the truma himself; he'll give it to his family. Still, if he's tamei and everybody knows that he's tamei, he just came from a levaya or something, we're not going to give him the truma. Somebody who married a woman that a not kosher woman, let's say a kohen married a grusha, we're not giving him truma either, b'shum kenosa, because we want to punish him. Like obviously, we want to, ostracize him so that he will divorce his wife. Ella, now the question is, the wife of a kohen. The question is, El Isha my time aloi. Why don't we give truma if the wife of a kohen lines up by the gored? Why don't we distribute her truma? So then the Gemara says, Pligi bar a papa of Rav Huna b'derei Yeshua. There's a machlekes between a papa and Rav Huna b'derei Yeshua. Why? One says the reason why you're not going to distribute it to a wife of a kohen, mishum grusha. This is obviously you probably figured out. It's because we assume that one day maybe the kohen will divorce his wife. And she's not going to be the wife of a Kohen anymore. She's going to be a Yisraelis. And people are going to continue to give her truma because they didn't hear that she got divorced. The reason why we don't give it to a woman, because these places were like it didn't have a high traffic, put it that way. And therefore it's Mishum Yichud. She's going to be alone with a man that's distributing the truma. So we don't want problems there. So that's why we don't give it to a woman. My benai, what would be the difference? Ika benayu, there would be a difference if you find the granary, the manufacturing plant, Beidari de Karv Lamas, it's very close to the city. So if it's very close to the city, this plant, everybody knows what's going on in the city. And if this woman got a divorce, everybody who's working at the plant would have known that she got a divorce. But if it's still not a place where there's high traffic over there. So therefore, because in that case, the yichud problem exists, but the problem of mishum grusha would not exist. So if you hold mishum grusha, then you would be able to give her truma. If you hold the real problem is yichud, well, there's yichud over there, so we're not going to give her the truma. Iname, I could do the other case. The mirchak, it's very far from the city, so they have no idea if she got a divorce or not. But there's a high traffic area. So therefore, there's no problem of yichud. So according to that mandiyama, you could distribute truma to her. But according to the other mandiyama, because we're afraid she's divorced, well, since this manufacturing plant is far away from the city, so they don't know what's going on in the city, and perhaps this woman got a divorce. Nobody who's working at the plant heard about it. In that case, you would not distribute to this woman truma. Now, the Mishnah says, the Brisa says, you send them to their houses care packages. A man marries a woman that's not appropriate, you don't even send them a care package. Somebody who didn't get a circumcision, we would send them. Why would we send him? He didn't get a circumcision. He didn't get a bris. Why are we sending him truma? My tama, because the reason why an oral didn't get his truma, didn't give himself a circumcision, is because his brothers died, and therefore he was a kanas nefashis to give him a circumcision. So it's not his fault. So we send him truma. We don't let him come to the manufacturing plant, but we'll send them a package. Tame name. But so the Gemara says, Tame, so a man that became Tame, Nami are honest. A kohen that became Tame, it's not his fault. Maybe he, by accident, he went to the Levaya or something like that. So why wouldn't we send Truma to his house? And says the Gemara, Hai Nafish Unse, Hai Loi Nafish Unse. Aro is a big oinus, a big not his fault. But here, it's not really, he was careless. The kohen who became Tame is a careless kohen. So we're not going to even send him a care package. We'll tell him, make sure you don't get tummy again, because you don't want to send truma to a kohen that's tummy. He so easily can touch the truma and metame it. He'll have to hold it in a bag, bring it home, give it to his wife. So we'd rather him become tar first, and then he could come back. Tanu Rabbanim, rabbis taught, Ha'evid v'isha en cholkalam truma beis agronis. Eved and Isha, we would not distribute truma by the granary house. But Uvamakam shecholkim, in a place that they do distribute, nicely ishatchila or paitron rice miyad. You give the woman, if there's a whole queue of people lining up and there's a woman on that line, you give her first, and then you send her home right away. So the Gemara says, "My ka'amar, what are you saying over here? You told me you're not supposed to give to a woman at all, and then you tell me that if she's on the line, the queue, you give her first. No, hachi ka'amar. This is what the Bryce means. Really, truma we don't distribute because truma was picked up at the manufacturing plant and therefore outside, and we don't want women to go there. But in Meiser Ani, which is the 10% of the produce that you give to the poor people, the women came to your house. So then if there's a line of people at your house and you're distributing Meiser Ani, so they're lining up, knocking at your door, then if you see a line, you should pick the woman out and give her her share of Meiser Ani first and let her go home. My tama, what's the reason? Why do you let the woman cut the line? So the answer is because a woman waiting online is mishim ziluse. It's degrading. A woman feels more degrading standing online than a man. A man doesn't feel that bad staying online. A woman does. So you should give her first. Very interesting Gemara. Amar Rava. Rava said, Rava had a courthouse. Meresha, in the beginning, when I had a queue of people lining up to meet the judge, myself, Rava, if there were men and women on this line, to come for a judgment in front of me, have a Sharina Tigra de Gavra. I would allow the men to go first because I want them to go home because a man has a lot of mitzvahs to do. And therefore, why should I hold him up? Let him cut the line and let him ask me his question and then go home. Amina de Mechaya mitzvahs. But Kevin de Mishaman Allah, since I heard this teaching of this brisa that says that you should let the woman cut the line, because for a woman to wait online she feels it more, and therefore it's more degrading. Sharina Tigra de Itzis, I allow the question of the woman to come first. My tama mishum zelusa, because it's degrading to have a woman wait online. The Mishnah continued and said, Higdilu hataroidis. So the Mishnah says, as these kids grow up, one's the Eved and one's the Kohen, the Mishnah says, if they would free each other, then the one will be Yisrael. Let's say the Eved, let's say they agree to free each other. So the Eved in this pool of Kohen and Eved will now become a Yisrael, because once he's freed, he's like a regular Jew. So the Mishnah sounds like it's a choice to do that. If they want to free, if he wants to free the Eved, Iboya en, you can do it. Iloi boya, loi, he shouldn't do it. He doesn't have to do it. Va'amai, why? Because if you have a person who's a suffix that he's an Eved, a suffix that he's a Kohen, he can't marry anybody. And therefore, why can't he marry a Eved? Why can't he marry a Shifcha? Because maybe he's a Kohen. Why can't he marry a Yisraelis? Because maybe he's an Eved. So we don't know who he is. So we always have a rule: when you have a person that's in a situation that you don't know if he's an Eved, we force the masters to give freedom to them so they can marry a regular person. So the Gemara says, "Vamai, why is it a choice over here? If you want to free this person, Lisa Shivcha Enoyakal, he can't marry a maid. Bas Chayrin Enoyakal, he can't marry a free person because he might be a Eved." Amar Rava, so you have to read the Mishnah a little different. Ema koifen oisra meshachrin zeh et zeh. You force them to free each other. So the Kohenes, the Kohen and the Eved, now one is a Kohen and one's Yisrael. We force them to free each other, because we don't know who's the Kohen, who's the Eved. Now you're dealing with a regular Kohen and regular Yisrael. Then the Mishnah ended off that once you have a person who is a Kohen or a Yisrael, we just don't know what he is, he has the stringencies of a Kohen and the stringencies of a Yisrael. What does that mean? Lamai Hilkasa, what halacha does you have the stringencies of both? So Amar Papa said, Limin Chasam Nikmetzes. Let's just see this picture over here. When one of the things that you bring, a Yisrael could bring, is called a karban mincha. And what they do is kamitza. You see this guy? You scoop out the flour, and what do you do with the flour? You put it in a pan, and then you put levana on it, and then you bring it on the mizbeach. Okay, hold on. You bring it onto the mizbeach, and then afterwards that's how you salt it and you throw it onto the mizbeach. You throw this little piece, that scoop, onto the mizbeach. And what happens with the rest of the mincha? You know what happens with the rest of the mincha? The beginning of the mincha, after you take that scoop out, the rest of the mincha, you make it into matzahs, and it was eaten by the kohen as a gift for doing the service. But that's if a Yisrael brings a mincha. If a kohen brings a mincha, the whole thing is brought onto the mizbeach. You throw the whole thing on the mizbeach. There's no kamitza done. So the Gemara says, It's because this person is a Suffolk Kohen or Suffolk Yisrael, Amar Papa said, their kmitza is you do kmitza like it was a Jewish mincha, but the leftover you're not going to. It's not eaten because maybe they're a kohen. Maybe if they're a kohen mincha, they're supposed to put the whole thing on the mizbeach. So Hakeitzid, what do you do with these guys who's a Suffolk kohen, Suffolk Yisrael, when they want to bring a mincha? So first, a kaimitz karav la'atmai, they throw the kaimitz, the scoop, onto the mizbeach. The hashirayim, but the leftovers, they also throw it. Kravim ba'atzman are thrown onto the mizbeach. So the Gemara asks, but that's not a good idea. Ikru Khan, we have a problem over here. The pasuk says, "Kol shmimen ishim harayu babal taktiru." Once you put a kmitza on the mizbeach, the Torah says the rest of them you're not allowed to throw on the mizbeach. So it's an issa daraisa to throw something on the mizbeach after you threw the kmitza. You can't makrav twice, basically. Once you do a kmitza and did a hakrava onto the mizbeach, you can't take the leftovers and throw it onto the mizbeach. So what do? You have only one chance. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Bereider Shimon Pazi. Rabbi Yehuda is the name of Rabbi Shimon Pazi, and son of Rabbi Shimon Pazi says, you're not throwing it on as a service. You could say, I'm throwing the leftovers as wood, as firewood. So that's permitted because you're not throwing it as a service. So you're not being over the pasuk. The masik lulishim eitzim. You throw the leftovers of this mincha as wood, as firewood. Rab Loza, like Rab Loza came up with this idea. The Tanya we learned in Rab Loza. Rab Loza says the reich nechoyach. You're not allowed to give God pleasant twice. You have only one chance. Iyatamala, you can't throw it again. Avatamala l'shem eitzim. You can throw something on the mizbeach. Is if you have intention that I don't want it to be on the mizbeach al krava, but I want it to be on the mizbeach like firewood. I'm throwing on the mizbeach, fuel for the fire there. So the Gemara says, this idea was given by Rab Laza, but the Rabbanan disagreed with this idea. So what do you do with this shirayim? So there is another idea what you can do. The Ovid like Rab Shimon, you do what Rab Laza Rab Shimon said. He says that you're going to throw the shirayim onto the side of the mizbeach where you do the trumas adeshim. Remember, if we had trumas adeshim where you take a little ashes off the mizbeach every morning and you throw it on the side of the ramp, on the floor, that's where you put it. The Tanya Rabbi Lazar Shimon Oima, you have to know what he's talking about over there, but he's talking about a kohen that has to bring a carbon oil of the yaira and he can't afford it, so he's bringing a mincha. There, the Torah says you should do kemitza, and the Torah says for the kohen, even if it's a kohen bringing this mincha, he does kemitza. But the Torah doesn't tell you what to do with the leftovers. So Rabbi Lazar Rishim says, the koimets you throw on the mizbeach, but the leftovers you throw on the side, the ramp, where the ashes are thrown. Over there, the Rabbanan had a different opinion what you should do with them, but not to throw it on the side of the ramp. Because the basakravi, really, technically, this belongs on the mizbeach, so you really shouldn't throw it on the side of the ramp. But in this case, you don't even know if the guy's a kohen or not. So technically, it is a possibility that you're not supposed to throw it on top of the mizbeach. I feel the Rabbanan Maida that you throw it on the side of the ramp on the floor where the ashes are placed. So you have two ideas what to do when these Suffolk kohen, Suffolk Yisrael bring a mincha. But they have the stringencies of both. New Mishnah. The Mishnah is discussing over here, you have to wait 3 months before you can get married. You know that because you have to know that if the woman's pregnant, who is the father of the kid. So let's take a look at this quick picture over here. This picture describes Yitzchak was married to Sarah. Okay, let's say Yitzchak was married to Sarah. Simply put, Yitzchak had a son with Sarah called Shimon. Now he gave Sarah a divorce. And Sarah didn't wait 3 months. She's excited. She got married to Yaakov within the 3 months, and they had a boy, Reuven. So you don't know who's the dad of Reuven. Either it's Yitzchak, the previous father, or is it Yaakov, the second father? Next. Then, after a while later, you have Yaakov and Sarah had Levi. Okay? So now, the din is like this. Reuven doesn't know if he's a brother of Shimon, from the father or brother of Levi from the father. But for sure, he's a brother of the mother because they all share a common mother, which is Sarah. So when Reuven dies, Shimon and Levi must do chalitza because Reuven is their brother from their mother's side. So there is no Yibam over there. And it's only a suffix if there are it's a suffix if they're related from the father's side. So therefore, we require a chalitza, but we do not allow Yibam. And Huadin, the same thing. If Shimon and Levi die, then Reuven is the one who's in charge over here. He will do chalitza and not Yibam. What happens, and we'll just speak out the case. The second case, and that's the last chart for today. The second case is the same scenario over here, but what's different here is that Yitzchak had another wife, and through that wife, he had Shimon. And the Yaakov had another wife, and through that wife, he had Levi. Then, so Sarah only gave birth to one person, Reuven. But the question was, since she got a divorce from Yitzchak, and she ran within 3 months to get married to Yaakov, now you don't know who the dad of Reuven is. So then this scenario is a little different because either he's related to Shimon or Levi as brothers from the father, because maybe they share a common father, or they're not related at all because they don't share a common mother and they don't share a common father. If it turns out the other one is the father to the opposite son. So we can say that in this case, one does chalitza, the other one does yibim. So if Reuven dies, we'll say, Levi, you do chalitza, because maybe he was your brother, and Shimon could do yibim, because no matter what. If Reuven was his brother, then Shimon's doing yibim. If Reuven was not his brother, they're not related at all, because they don't share a common mother. And that's the Mishnah. Mishnah says, Mi shaloi shohasa acha bala shloisha chadashim. A woman did not wait 3 months to before she got married to somebody else. So there's a problem. Venisas Violda, she got married, Violda, and she had a child. The ain you do it, you don't know now, in ben tisha l'rishon, in ben shiva la'acharon. Is this child the 9th month of the first or the 7th month of the second? So hoyaloi bonim in a rishon, bonim in a sheni, if you already had children from the first marriage and from the second marriage, and this child is the suffix, so we don't know if they are related from the father or not, but they're for sure related from the mother because this one mother had all 3 kids. He had one kid from the first marriage and the suffix, and then another kid from the second marriage. So chotzim v'loy miyabim, you have to get chalitza and not yibam, because chalitza you need because maybe they're related, or v'loy miyabim you can't because if they're not related by the father, they're certainly related by the mother, and you can't do yibam on your mother's on a brother that you're only connected with by the mother. They do chalitz and not miyibam. We go to Amid Beis. Let's say you had brothers from the first one and brothers from the second one, but so now they don't share the common mother. So the question is, are they brothers from the father's side or nothing at all? So then, who chalitz miyabim? One could do chalitz and the other one could do yibim, or and he chalitz miyabim. If he's doing it for them, one of them echad chalitz ve'echad miyabim. By them, if he dies, one does chalitza, one does yibim. If they die, he can do chalitza to one and miyabim to the other wife. Okay, now the Mishnah discusses like this: a woman who was married to Yisrael. Let's say he was married to a regular Jew, and within 3 months, she got divorced, whatever, and she goes ahead and marries a Kohen within 3 months, and she has a baby with that. And we don't know, is it a child of the first? So who's the father of this child? Was it the first marriage, Yisrael, or the second marriage, the Kohen? So you have one person who's a suffix Yisrael or suffix Kohen. We had this case. So her first husband was Yisrael, and the second husband was a Kohen. And she got married within 3 months. So now you don't know who's the father of this baby, the Yisrael or the Kohen. So the truth is we treat him like a Kohen, but almost like a Kohen. You can only marry a woman that's appropriate for a Kohen. He cannot marry a Grusha. He can't go to a Beis HaKavaros. If he does become Tameh, we don't give him malchus because he may not be a kohen, so he didn't do anything wrong. We don't feed him truma because he's a Yisrael, maybe. If he does eat truma, he doesn't pay the fine of 20% more because maybe he was a kohen and he could eat truma. He can't line up at the manufacturing plant, of course, to collect truma because he might be Yisrael. And if he owns truma, he could sell his truma. He doesn't have to give it to a kohen because he could always say, "Prove me that I'm not a kohen." So he sells his own truma. The money remains his own. And another thing about this person who's a Suffolk Kohen, Suffolk Yisrael, he can't go serve in the Beis Hamikdash and get a portion of the gifts of the Kohen, let's say the skins of the animal that they give to the Kohanim that serve in the Beis Hamikdash. Obviously, we don't allow him to serve in the Beis Hamikdash because he's not a for sure Kohen. If he has to bring a carbon, we allow him to choose whichever Kohen he wants. We don't force him to use a specific Kohen as we would do when a Yisrael brings a carbon, and there's no matnos kahuna from him. In other words, if he has gifts that are supposed to be given to the kohen, he could keep it himself because we always have this rule. If you want to take money from somebody, you have to prove without a shadow of a doubt that he's required to give you the money. And since nobody can prove that he's not a kohen, he could always say, "I'm a kohen. I don't have to give you my gifts." If he has a bechor, so a Yisrael who has a Bechor has to give it to the Kohen. Since he's a Suffolk, he could be a Kohen himself. He lets his Bechor pasture until it gets a mum, and then he can keep it for himself. We keep him, we put on him as if the stringencies of a Kohen and the stringencies of Yisrael. Then the Mishnah says, if they were both Kohanim, okay, if they were both Kohanim, so let's say the two fathers are Kohanim. So the two fathers are Kohanim, who oinein alehem. So what happens is that when either father dies, he has a din of an oinein. So he for sure is a Kohen, because if the two dads were Kohanim and we don't know who's his dad, we know for sure he's a Kohen. So therefore, when any one of them dies, he's not permitted to eat, let's say, kachim, because he's a mourner. And they mourn for him when he dies, because they don't, perhaps that when he dies, their father, to respect the fathers, they don't know, maybe it's their son that died, so therefore they have to keep abelis on him when he dies. He's not allowed to go and bury them because maybe it's not his father. They're not to bury him because maybe it's not his son. He doesn't inherit them because he can't prove that I'm for sure your son. When he dies and he has nobody, let's say, to collect if he dies and there's nobody else collecting Yerusha, they divide up the Rusha between the two fathers because each one could say, he was my son or my son. So if you have money that you don't know whose it is, so you can divide it between the two of them. If he cursed his father or if he hit his father, he's exempt because the person that he's hitting may be not his father. Maybe the other one is his father. He can always point to two different fathers. He can serve in the Beis Hamikdash, but he doesn't partake in any of the gifts of the payments for a kohen. Why? Because they could always say, you don't belong in our group. You're a kohen, but your service is supposed to happen in another time of the year. So they don't distribute the gifts, the wages that the Kohanim get for serving in the Beis Hamikdash, because maybe his family was not supposed to serve at that time. But if the two fathers were in the same family and they serve at the same time in the Beis Hamikdash, then he would take one portion in when he serves in the Beis Hamikdash, because for sure he is a kohen and supposed to serve. Another 2 more minutes and then we'll stop. Dafka bichlatz v'hada yabumi. In all the cases, we require that the one of them do chalitza. In the second case, where yibum is allowed, because perhaps either they're not related, but we require chalitza first and then yibum. Alva yibum b'reish aloi. He can't do yibum to this person first, because maybe this is not his brother. And the kabaga be Yavama Lashuk because he's dealing with a Yavama that's supposed to be, has a bond with somebody. Before she gets chalitza, she can't marry somebody else. So first step one is chalitza, and then we allow the yibum in the Mishnah. One more point, and then we'll stop by one of the kashas over here. Amar Shmuel. Shmuel says a fascinating statement over here. You have Asara Kahanim Oimdim. 10 Kahanim are standing around. Right there, they're schmoozing in a bar. Uperish Echem Mehem, one of them separates from the group, Ubal, and had intercourse with a woman. And the kid was born. So you know it's for sure a Kohen, right? Because there are only Kahanim in this group. But you don't know who's the father. It's one of the 10. Havlad Shtuki. The Vlad, we keep silent. My Shtuki, what does that mean? We keep silent. Ilema Mishat Kenoisim Nishkayav, we don't allow him to inherit his father. Pshita, of course he doesn't inherit his father, because it's one of 10. Miyadin and Avu Amani, do we know who his father is? Elo, we say Shemshatkin Oisei Medin Kahuna. What means is that we don't allow him to serve in the Beis Hamikdash. I know he's a Kayin, but Shmuel says you don't allow him to serve in the Beis Hamikdash. My time, or what's the reason? Amakara, the pasuk says, by a Kahanim, it says V'hoiser loy l'zare achron, that the Parshas Pinchas, that the pasuk says that the only time you can serve as a kohen is if the person can point that that's my father. I know for sure he's a father. If you know you're for sure you're a kohen, but you can't determine who's your father, you're puzzled from serving the Beis Hamikdash. We need the father, the son, to be able to point out to who his father, and in this case, he doesn't have that. One more question. We have a similar pasuk, but it says by Avraham Avinu, God will be to you as a God and to your children who follow you. And so just like you learn, Zare Achra means the child has to follow his father, so he has to know who his father is. What is that pasuk teaching you by Avraham? What is that teaching you by Avraham Avinu? That his children follow after his father. And says the Gemara, this is what the pasuk is really saying. We don't want you to marry, your children should not marry out. They should not intermarry a goy or shivcha, because the children will follow her, not you. We want your children, the Bnei Avram, have to follow Avraham. And so if they marry out, that's how you know a Jew that marries a goy, the kid is a goy. One more question. Meisaveh, the Gemara says, Risha and Roy Elias Kain Gadol. When two Kahanim get mixed up, we say that the first child could serve in the Beis Hamikdash and be a Kain Gadol. So this is a clear refutation to Shmuel. We need a son in order to serve in the Beis Hamikdash. Shmuel said that the child has to be able to follow after his father. And in that case, the Leka, you don't have that. He doesn't know who his father is. And the Brisa says that even if you don't know who the child is, he could be a Kain Gadol. And says the Gemara, Zare miyuchas acharav d'Rabbanan. This whole idea that you have to know who the father is in order to allow this Kain to serve in the Beis Hamikdash is only in Issur d'Rabbanan. Ukra asmachta be'alma. The Kra is just a smachta, means just a signpost, but it's not really. It's a way to remember it, but it's only the Rabbanan made it up. Chi gazer Rabbanan biznus. When the Rabbanan said biznus, if there was an act of znus, immorality, 10 Kahanim standing around and one Kohen just breaks off and has nus, and then comes back to the group, and we don't know who the father is, then we don't allow the child to serve in the Beis Hamikdash. B'nisuin, if it was an accidental marriage, if it had to do with marriage, Loi, Gazer, Rabbanan, and this is where we'll stop. In that case, when it was accidental, you did it legally, and it just a mistake happened, you don't know who the father is, then that child could serve in the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so we will stop, Be'ezus Hashem, over here.